I'm Ewa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And you may know Rebecca Nagle from her podcast, This Land, which is now in its second season. And the first season, well, it was a minute ago, but now there's a book. And I love this book. By the Fire We Carry takes This Land, and it takes some of what you've heard and expands it into a story that I promise you cannot put down. And it's a combination of current affairs and legal studies and American history and Rebecca's own family story, which, yeah, maybe we start there. But Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really excited to sit down with you and talk about the book.
I have sort of a two-part question to start, but there are so many threads to this story. We've got a murder from 1999. We've got your family story. We've got the Supreme Court cases. You're working in a couple of different major timelines, but when did you really start thinking about this particular piece of reporting?
You know, I think there's a couple different ways to answer that question. The case that's sort of the spine of the book is this Supreme Court case that resulted in the largest restoration of tribal land in U.S. history. And I first heard about that case in 2017, back before it even went to the Supreme Court, actually through a Facebook post from the legal scholar Sarah Deer. At that point, it was just a case of a man on Oklahoma's death row trying to get rid of his death sentence by arguing his crime occurred on a reservation. And Oklahoma said that reservation no longer existed. And I kind of just became obsessed with the case. I wrote about it for Any Country Today, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and then the podcast, This Land. And then, honestly started thinking about turning it into a book almost immediately. And then it was maybe about a year after the podcast that I put a proposal together and then obviously started working on it. And so there's just, I love audio. Obviously, it's an amazing format, but there's a lot that you can't do in audio in terms of depth and breadth. There's a certain point where, the podcast listener is the distracted listener. They're doing their dishes, they're driving, they're on a walk, they're walking their dog. And so there's an intimacy to audio that I love. But there's only so much information that you can pack into a podcast before someone who's, just passively listening is going to be like, okay, I can't follow this. And so I was really excited to take these complicated topics and to really just, completely afresh, dive into the research and present the story and all of its complications and nuance. And I think even though it covers a lot of similar ground to the podcast, it's actually, I think, surprisingly different.
No, it is.
Yeah.
I think that's a totally fair statement. One of the things I really appreciate about the book is the level of detail that you can go into. This is one of those books, sometimes with narrative nonfiction, you get really lucky and you feel much smarter after you've read the book. But I also feel like you told me a story. I got really invested in the people. I got really invested in the arguments that were being made. Like, I don't often think of the Supreme Court as a place where, actually it's the rhetoric that matters, right? Like, we think it's the actual law and the structure of the law and, legal sort of maneuvering. And ultimately, the arguments are made in 90-second bursts in some cases. Cases get pushed. It really is, it's a little bit of performance art.
Yeah. And I think also more political than we think it is necessarily. And so I think, the book, one of the things I'm passionate about as a journalist is that I think a lot of these things that really impact our lives, like the Supreme Court or, the terrain of federal Indian law, who has jurisdiction on a reservation, all this kind of stuff, it's so dense and complicated. I think many people feel like it's not accessible. And so one of the things I'm really passionate about is writing about these legal things, but writing about it in a way where you don't need to be a lawyer. Like you don't need to have a law degree or really much knowledge about the Supreme Court at all to be in the story and to get what's going on. And I think that sweet spot is having it be accessible without dumbing it down or watering it down. Which isn't always easy to do. It takes like several tries. And sometimes I have to go back to a legal scholar and be like, okay, I really simplified this. Is it still accurate? Is this still is this simplified version correct? But yeah, and I think, I hope that people feel like the book accomplishes that.
It flies. The narrative flies. So I want to talk about pacing for a second, because obviously rule number one in journalism is tell the story, tell it correctly, but also there is a pacing that comes with, let's call it newspaper work for the moment, newspaper magazine. There's a timeliness that you have to capture. You've got to keep people's attention. You only have, so many lines of copy. You only have so many words. How did you learn the physical craft part of the piece? I mean, clearly you know how to tell a story, but there's also a craft piece of it that doesn't necessarily align perfectly from audio to print. But
yeah.
You have something going on that's really fun and interesting and smart, and I'm just wondering how you developed that.
The way I approach writing is I often say I don't think of myself necessarily as a good writer. I try to think of myself as a good editor. And so I just embrace the messy first draft. So, and I'm pretty like systematic in the way that I write. And so, I do a ton of research. So, for the legal story and the legal case, which is just one thread, I went through probably like 10,000 pages of legal documents. I just went back to the beginning in the original crime and read every piece of paper I could get my hands on. And in 20 years of appeal, it's a lot of paper, And I would make these like long documents of notes, and then I would outline the chapters and then plug in, the relevant notes into that outline, and then sort of write that in a narrative and then edit it and edit it and edit it and edit it. And I wrote the book in these chunks. So the book has this double weave where, there'll be a chapter that follows the more modern case and then a chapter in the past. And I would write the books in these chunks, and then I would read them and kind of sit back. And a few times during the writing process, I would sort of take a break from writing and spend a couple weeks just thinking about the big picture and the narrative. And so I was actually kind of surprised. The structure of the book didn't change a lot from the original outline, which almost never happens. So it's pretty close in the original outline. But then what was more specifically in each chapter, that shifted a lot. And so, there are chapters that no longer exist that got, chewed up and the information spread into other chapters. Yeah, there was a lot of shifting parts. And then I think one of the big things in that double weave was to sort of keep that momentum. It's almost like the end of the chapter, trying to keep it like, that TV show where like in the last 2 minutes, you're like, oh no, now I have to watch the next one. I'm just going to like sit here and keep watching this TV show when I should be going to bed. But like trying to have the chapters end at that place where it keeps the person engaged and you want to see what's happening next, as it goes back and forth between the present day and the past. And that was really tricky, I think where the double weave of the narrative starts and stops, that was one thing that shifted a lot in the editing process.
So you open with this 1999 murder of George Jacobs by a man called Patrick Murphy, who was in jail at the time that his court case went to the Supreme Court. Oklahoma had given him the death penalty for his role in the murder. That's the first piece of the story. The second piece of the story, though, is your family's history. And I'm going to ask you to introduce your great, am I missing a great? Ridge and John Ridge. You're seventh generation of your family, and they were the first, right? So that's 6 times removed?
Yeah. So John Ridge is my great grandfather, and Major Ridge is his dad. Okay. And so they were Cherokee leaders at a time that our tribe was going through a lot of turmoil, and they made a controversial decision. The way that I was raised and, the stories that I heard growing up, mostly from my grandmother, was that they had sacrificed their lives for the sake of Cherokee Nation and that they were heroes. And it wasn't until I was a little bit older that I realized that that's not how the majority of Cherokees saw my family. The majority of Cherokees saw them as traitors and their acts as treasonous. And so as a journalist, and as an adult, I got to go back to those primary source documents, their own writing, what other Cherokees were saying at the time, the debate that they were in, and sort of draw my own conclusions as an adult. And so just to give a little bit more background about what
Yep.
was going on was Southern states really wanted Indigenous nations gone. Basically, they wanted the land that Indigenous nations had. And one of those Southern states was Georgia, and they were particularly aggressive about it. And so they came up with this policy of basically just harassing Cherokee Nation until Cherokee Nation would agree to leave. So they were torturing Cherokee citizens. They were selling off Cherokee land illegally, land that still belonged to the tribe. Cherokees were sort of literally kicked out of their homes. The situation was desperate. And Cherokee Nation had fought, in the halls of Congress, actually at the Supreme Court, done all of these different political and legal maneuvers to try to hold on to their land. And none of it had worked.
Mm-hmm.
And so my ancestors made a controversial decision that they thought that a removal treaty agreeing to leave our ancestral land, the land of our ancestors, the best option for Cherokee Nation. They thought it was the only way that Cherokees as a people and the nation would survive. And I think there's actually a lot, that we can learn from the story of the Ridges and the story of the treaty that they signed, the Treaty of New Echota. I think as Americans, we can learn a lot about actually U.S. policy at that time and how unrelenting and overwhelming the U.S. policy of ethnic cleansing was and what Indigenous nations were up against. And for me personally, I don't necessarily think that their decision was the right decision, but I think that they made it for the right reason, if that makes sense. And when I think about their sacrifice, the thing that I think a lot about is I think we live in an age where people are really concerned about like what other people think of them. I mean, I do that. I think just like most people, and they really stood up for what they believed was right and took actions that they knew that they would be judged for. One of the things that I write in the book is that, it's one thing to choose a death of honor, but it's another thing to choose a death of disgrace. And they sacrificed, their lives knowing that they wouldn't be remembered for that sacrifice, but for treason. And I think that that's a kind of sacrifice that we don't see from our political leaders that often. That's a really big part of the narrative. It was really powerful for me to be able to go back to those documents and read my family's writing and their speeches and see what they were thinking and what they were living through at that time. And also just like, to me, it was also shocking how relevant that story still is to our politics today.
It's hard to imagine now. And I mean, we're all taught sort of varying versions, right, of Native American removal from around the US. And some people don't learn it at all, and some people learn pieces of it. I mean, I grew up in Massachusetts, so I have one of the biggest pieces of mythology ever. Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
But the way we teach this piece of our history, it's missing in so many ways, and it's missing in so many places. And Ned Blackhawk won the National Book Award, last year for his book. And that was another one where I was like, oh, this just fills in so many.
Yeah, it's a really important book.
Part of what it seems to me that you're doing with the book too is making sure that we don't get to forget how we got here. Because you bring us into 2020 and 2020. A couple of these cases were decided in 20 and 21. And to see that, right, and to watch how you bring us from, the 1800s into 4 years ago. I mean, you and I are taping this in 2024. It's a scope and a viewpoint that we don't often get. It's kind of like, here's all of the stuff that happened back when America was being founded. And yes, those are air quotes. And here's where we are right now. And it's rare to get that kind of entire swing of history, right? I mean, did you feel like you had anything to model this book on?
Oh, that's a really good question. Not exactly. One of the books I thought about a lot, which I actually don't think it's structurally that similar, but one of my favorite nonfiction books is The Warmth of Other Suns.
Yeah.
And I think what Wilkerson does really masterfully in that book is document a wave of history through personal story. And you're so invested in the people and the reporting that she's done. And, you follow three people, but then you also really get a sense of the Great Migration and how it reshaped US politics. And it gave me an understanding that I didn't have. And I think that wasn't really part of our public consciousness before she started writing about it in the way that she did. And so I thought a lot about that. And I knew that I wanted a nonfiction book that would be story first, that would be really driven by the story and would envelop the reader, but also convey a lot of information. And so, yeah, I thought about that book a lot too. But it braids the narrative, I guess, but it doesn't hop back and forth in time. It's just more that you're following three different characters.
Millie Naharki is a young woman who I had not heard of until By the Fire We Carry. Can you introduce her to listeners, please, and explain how, because she pulls together a moment where greed and power and money and violence and all sorts of terrible things, including theft and scamming, all come together in sort of one moment. And then there's a piece of her story that I have to say, there are lots of exclamation points in my copy of The Galley, but once you introduce her, I'll explain what that piece was that made me go, oof.
To talk about Millie Naharki, I just want to back up for a second and introduce people to allotment. And so, as we talked about, our tribes aren't originally from the land that we're on now here in Oklahoma. We're originally from the Southeast. And in the 1830s, we were forced into exile into what was then called Indian Territory. And that land was promised to us for forever, but that promise wasn't kept. And at the turn of the 19th century, the US decided that it wanted that land too, and came up with this policy called allotment. And so through allotment, communally owned land by the tribe was privatized and assigned to individual tribal citizens. And this was supposed to turn Native Americans into self-serving capitalists and assimilate us to white society and make us rich and make us better. And instead, the opposite happened. What happened was there was just it's sort of an unimaginable scale of predation because Native Americans still didn't have a lot of rights at that time, and could be very easily not listened to in the courts. It was sort of the sort of a lot of property being held by a lot of people who didn't have a lot of rights. There was basically every scam you can imagine, from people trying to swindle orphans to people forging documents, people kidnapping these tribal citizens that had land. And Millie Naharki is a woman who was born into allotment. So she was literally a baby when the policy was going forward. And when she was assigned land, several of her family members die in quick succession under unexplained circumstances. And then she really is followed by the corruption of this policy from the cradle to the grave. And in one of the most tragic things that happened to her is, one of many things that happened to her is that she's actually kidnapped at a certain point and abducted by an oil businessman who wants to basically get her to sign her land away to him, for a paltry amount of money. And that was how I found out about her story. I'd heard about the story of this Creek woman who was kidnapped, and I started looking into it. And then as I went through court records, her BIA reel, the probate files, or not her BIA reel, her BIA file, and went through the land records. Just went through like thousands of pages of documents. I realized that the kidnapping was actually only one chapter in the story, and not there was a ton of really awful things that happened to her just because she had the misfortune of being assigned land that turned out to be very valuable.
And ultimately, she is successful in a claim and receives a payment that is not insignificant. But the thing that I'm stuck on is that you said she died in 1996 and she still had a legal guardian until she died. And this is 40 something years after she has successfully argued her case. She is given a payment that at the time was $44,000, which was the equivalent of what, $1 million, I think you say?
Yeah.
I still can't wrap my mind around the fact that this woman had a guardian until and she petitioned multiple times saying, I'm an adult and I am of sound mind and what is happening here? And the state of Oklahoma kept saying, How?
Yeah.
How is that possible?
It's actually was very, very, very common. And so one of the things that would happen is if a Native person, say their land, usually it was oil, but there could be other reasons that their land was valuable, but most often it was oil. If oil was discovered on their land, anybody could file a petition and have them declared legally incompetent. And then that person would be assigned a guardian. And then the guardian, not that person, would decide how that money was spent, also who could drill oil on the land, if the land was going to be sold, all of those things. And so one of the things that I found that was really shocking was I went through decades of Millie's probate file. And so I could see kind of all of the reports that her guardian was submitting to the judge. And you can see every time, like she got a little allowance, but then anytime she needed money for something beyond what the allowance allowed, she had to basically apply for money to get it. And so she applied to get dentures, a garage, to pay to tow her car, for things like towels and curtains. I mean, just the Christmas presents, just very basic needs. And I think that, it shows how just one of the many ways that the way this policy was carried out in Oklahoma was so dehumanizing to Native people. And so, buried in her probate file, one of the things that I found was an application to enroll her in Medicare. And so, I mean, and because she was declared legally incompetent, she couldn't take any legal action on her own. So when she wanted to get a divorce, she couldn't file for divorce. And so it wasn't just, somebody controlling the money connected to her land. It was something that really hung over her entire life.
Still makes my teeth itch just thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really enraging. Yeah.
And 1996 is not that long ago.
It's really not that long ago. And I think, I think for a lot of readers, people don't know about allotment. I think a lot of people don't know about, the history of really what happened, not that long ago. And I think, we've got Killers of the Flower Moon. We've got, people starting to talk about the Osage murders. And so I think some of this history is beginning to surface, but there's still just a lot that I think as a society, and even here in Oklahoma in our Native communities, that I feel like we still have a lot to learn and a lot to talk about in terms of the legacy of allotment and the damage that it did to people.
It also makes me think about how we teach about the opening of the American West, that sort of very fundamental piece of American mythology. You go west, young man, go make your fortune. And the idea, and you describe it in one of the chapters in the book, where 2 million acres are made available and literally all you have to do is plant a flag and you can just claim the land. And so cities would spring up and towns would spring up and main streets and all of this kind of thing. But the idea, if you hold that in one hand and then you hold the Trail of Tears in the other hand, where people are given no resources and moved out of their homes and sent to a place that they don't know, they have no... I mean, in some cases, people didn't even have shoes when they were sent out. Looking at those two sort of pieces of our history took me to a place where I was not surprised by some of what you were talking about in the present day with either of the court cases and how the court cases were argued and how Native Americans were viewed historically and into the present day. Beyond this sort of general incapacity, there was a label attached to them that there was fear-mongering. And that's sort of a note that I left throughout your galley, is that the way the arguments were made by the state of Oklahoma, there was a lot of fear-mongering. And so I'm like, but you're telling me that Millie is incompetent and can't buy towels and can't buy Christmas presents and can't manage her own affairs and can't get divorced. And yet the flip side is, well, the community is unpredictable. It's violent. Terrible things happen. And I'm just looking at this going, well, what?
Yeah.
So can we talk about how you sort of got from the historical, because it's not just research. I mean, you're also looking at your own community and you're looking at what happened to your community as well. So there's an emotional component for you that might not be there for another journalist or another researcher.
Mm-hmm.
So getting us from, 1830s to the 1920s into the present day, like what does that research look like for you? Are you just following sort of leads as they uncover?
Yeah, I mean, the research was different depending on the time period, and so the documents that exist are really different. So, the like 1830s, early 1800s research, some documents were hard to find. There's not as much writing. The early 1900s research, the problem was the opposite. I mean, allotment created it was land theft through bureaucracy. It was land theft by paper and pen. And so it left in its wake, damage and destruction, but also just a ton of paperwork. And so it was almost the opposite problem of having too many documents and really having to be like more specific in where we dug. Like I said, just looking into one Alati story, just looking into Millie Naharki, between the lawsuits and her BIA file and the allotment jackets and the land records and the press coverage and her probate file, it was thousands of pages of documents. Her BIA file alone was 4 volumes. And so there's just a lot. And then in the present day, again, it's just, a lot of the court records, you have to go different places. Even getting the court records, it depends on the court, right? And
right.
so getting the Supreme Court records, those are easy. Those are all online. But going back to, the original crime, I became friends with the court reporter from 1999.
Yep.
Trixie Ingram, shout out to Trixie Ingram. But, I had to, because the court reporter owns the transcripts and you have to buy it from them. And I had to track down, this woman who transcribed this case 20 years ago, She actually was really nice, and she dropped off a giant cardboard box to my house. So, and that's one of the things I think you learn as a journalist, that even though the historical records was very different, you kind of learn that as a journalist, that every set of records or every records keeper has a different little, they have different hoops that you need to jump through, a different process. And, you learn how to use PACER, or you learn how to use OSCN, or you learn how to read this type of court document or this type of land record. And that's one of the things I love about being a journalist is I'm endlessly curious. So I got to just be curious and scratch that curiosity and scratch that itch. So, and one of the things I really like to do too as a writer is take that mountain of research and really distill it down into something that is storied and that is accessible. And I think you can have a sense of the research that went into the book when you're reading it without it feeling overwhelming, I hope.
I also feel like the people are always first. And even as you're talking about like the court reporter that you became friends with, I didn't know court reporters own their transcripts, but you're always starting with the people, right? Like there are actual gatekeepers that you have to figure out how to work with in order to find the information, or you discover a name of a person who had an entire identity and a life and everything else and isn't just a name on a piece of paper. And as I was reading the book, I felt like I had a really good idea of who these people are. And sometimes, not everyone is a great human being. We meet all sorts of not great human beings, but the cause is ultimately like the bigger picture piece of all of it comes together in such a way where you're like, oh, okay. So can we go back to the court cases for just a second and just because I think you and I can talk about them without spoiling anything, because I think the reading experience is so good on this book and the narrative just keeps pushing through that There are a couple of things that you and I could accidentally talk about that would give away
Yeah.
more than we would like to. But I think we can talk in broad strokes about the two main court cases, one that comes out of the original 1999 murder, and then one that's sort of a follow-up from a jailhouse lawyer, but gets us where we need to get in terms of some rights issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So going all the way back to the beginning, almost exactly 25 years ago now, the end of August in 1999, a Muskogee citizen named Patrick Murphy murdered another Muskogee citizen named George Jacobs. It happened near a small town called Vernon, literally on the side of a dirt road. It was a pretty brutal murder and brutal crime. Patrick was picked up by police the next day. It was a pretty open and shut investigation. And he went to trial a little bit less than a year later and was sentenced to death. So he was on Oklahoma's death row for a few years until a federal public defender got a hold of this case. So he'd appealed it a couple times, hadn't really made a dent, was still on death row, was still facing the death penalty. And I'll tell the story in detail because it's actually a pretty great story. So this federal public defender, Lisa McCalmont, she's basically just starting from the top and is just investigating the case as if, basically uncovering anything she could uncover, turning over every stone, following down every lead. And so she goes to interview a police officer that helped find the murder weapon. And they hadn't found the murder weapon. Oklahoma hadn't found the murder weapon. OSBI hadn't found the murder weapon. And this police officer, actually, with the tribal police from Muskogee Nation, had gone out after OSBI had searched the area and not found it. And he went out and found it himself and turned it in. And so this public defender went back to interview him. And he sort of looked at them and was like, "Oh, where are you guys going next?" And they're like, "Oh, we're going down to, actually look at the scene of the crime." And he was like, "Oh, where are you going?" And they pulled out a map of where they were going. And he knew the area quite well and then had been there when he had found the murder weapon. And he said, "Oh, the place on your map is wrong. That's not where the crime occurred." And they're like, "Okay." And so they drove out there. And they drove out to where he showed them the murder had occurred. And the family had actually put up a cross, a memorial, to remember George Jacobs. And so the public defender is standing at this new location and is seeing this cross and is like, Oklahoma got it wrong. Where they say the murder happened isn't where the murder happened. And so that leads to a lot of different stuff, but it got the team thinking about jurisdiction. If you are a prosecutor in New York City, you can't go over to Pennsylvania and prosecute a crime. And so they thought maybe there's something off about the location that Oklahoma doesn't have jurisdiction. They were thinking about, the difference between point A and point B near this small town in Oklahoma and whether or not, Oklahoma had jurisdiction. But that snowballed to a much bigger argument that actually Oklahoma didn't have jurisdiction over a much larger area, the entire reservation of Muskogee Nation, because it had never been disestablished. That was an area that was 3 million acres, about the size of Connecticut. And that question of, does the Muskogee Reservation still exist, was what eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Everyone has a job to do in this book. And some of the arguments, though, that the state made at the Supreme Court really turned into kind of this very outrageous fear-mongering, where it was like, well, if you say that the state has no jurisdiction, then suddenly we're going to have to open the doors to all of the jails, which is actually not how the law works at all. And so I have lots of notes that, are not family friendly, shall we say, in my galley. But I do want to talk about that because I think it goes back to quite a lot of the historical views that some Americans had of Native Americans.
Just to give a little bit of context, when we're talking about tribal land in the United States, generally states don't have the jurisdiction to prosecute Native Americans on tribal land. And instead, that jurisdiction goes to tribes or the federal government. And so Oklahoma had been prosecuting crimes on the Muskogee reservations and other reservations in eastern Oklahoma as if they didn't exist for over 100 years. And so they were saying, if you're saying this is tribal land, we didn't have jurisdiction to prosecute these crimes. And not only will this one person who committed this murder get out of jail, but these thousands, well, first it was hundreds, right? And then it was thousands. And then it was tens of thousands of past convictions that could be impacted or overturned. And so the most outrageous number that they used was 76,000 past convictions. So the governor started saying this. He first said it in an interview with a local Fox News reporter. And then that language got into their petition to the Supreme Court. They put it in official court documents. And at the time, the estimate was 3 times the number of people incarcerated in the state of Oklahoma total. It was over 60 times the native population from the impacted area. So over 60 times, the native people who were incarcerated from the affected area who the state would realistically lose jurisdiction over. And so it was just, from Mars, I went to the governor and asked, where did this estimate come from? Where did you guys get this? And they said, you'd have to ask the district attorneys. They gave us the estimate. We don't know. So I went to the district attorneys and said, hey, can you just forward me, the math you sent the governor's office so I can double check it? And I got this really surprising response from a couple of the district attorneys who got back to me. They said, we don't know what you're talking about. We didn't provide the governor with an estimate. And so, we went back and, we went back and forth with the governor's office a few more times and with the private lawyer that they hired on contract, but basically never got an explanation for the numbers. And the way that connects to history is that when Oklahoma was being created, one of the reasons that was given was crime. They were saying, without state, letting tribes govern this area, it's completely lawless. And there have been all of these crimes. And, there was this one reporter that at the time the area was called Indian Territory, that Indian Territory was the refuge for bank robbers and assassins and thieves. And one of the prominent people who really supported allotment, this guy named Senator Henry Dawes, lied and exaggerated the numbers about crime. And so it's literally, a century later, the excuse for divesting Native people of our land hadn't changed. It, just sort of circled back around to these exaggerations and these false claims about lawlessness. There are lots of moments in the book, I think, where we see history just completely repeat itself. And that's one of them, unfortunately.
Did writing this book change you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's the hardest thing I've ever done professionally. I would say it's like there's like harder stuff I've done like personally, like in my life, but in terms of like what I've done for work, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. And I really pushed myself. Mm-hmm. And I regularly felt like I pushed my brain to the limit of what it could do in a day. And I would think about it like I thought of my mind. I would think, I'm not an elite athlete and I actually don't really know what that's like. But in my mind, it was sort of like I thought of like training my mind and protecting my mind and using my mind the way like an elite athlete would use their body, getting enough food, getting enough sleep, getting enough rest, like having quiet. And then I just regularly felt like I was pushing my mind to the limit of its capacity with like the amount of information I was putting into it, and then synthesizing all of that information into something that was really coherent and, compelling. I feel like I stretched and I pushed myself as a writer. And I think who I am as a writer is very different on the other side of this book.
Have you started thinking about the next book?
Yeah, I have ideas. I haven't started them yet. So I'm trying to like get through the book launch and the book coming out and the tour, and then hopefully actually give myself a little bit of a break and then start the next project. But yeah, I do have an idea for another book that I would like to write.
Okay. I'm very happy to hear that. As one of your readers, I'm very, very happy to hear that. I think too, and I know I've said this, sort of throughout the show, but the way you balance sort of the present day and the history, the personal and the public. I mean, you are always, a lot of this book happens in the gray areas, and I really appreciate that. There is no, you're not standing, sorry, I'm going to use a Boston reference for a second, but that city on a hill stuff, you're not doing any of that. You're just like, hey, listen, I'm going to tell you a story. And it is actually going to change the way you think about sovereignty. It's going to change the way you think about power and money and access and justice. And I think it's really important what you've done here.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I think especially with, my ancestors and my family story, like I didn't want it to feel like I was trying to protect their legacy or save their reputation. I think that they're complicated people and that they made mistakes. And I tried to be really transparent, honest about that. And I think even the case, I thought a lot about while I was writing the book about the members of George Jacobs' family and the people whose lives were really impacted by the trauma and the tragedy of the original murder. And there's a lot of tragedy in the book and in this story. And I think more than I expected when I started reporting. And I think that there are clear calls to truth and justice within the book, but it's not that in this clean and cookie cutter way. I think the story is complicated. The story is messy. The people are complicated, and our history is complicated. And so, yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because that was something. It was something I don't think I say explicitly in the book, but it was definitely something I thought a lot about while writing it.
It comes through. It definitely comes through. Just riffing off of something you just said where, people are complicated, our history is complicated. There is a not exceptional level of violence in the creation of America as we know her, certainly growing up in New England, like the way we're taught history in a lot of ways, or the way, we're taught any kind of colonial history for the States and where that took us and, how we got where we are. As much as you have written a book that is hopeful in some ways and really humane in others, I don't think we can totally put aside some of the darker bits. I mean, there is some stuff in the book that is not easy, but if we're going to tell the story of America, right? Like, let's tell the story. Like, we've spent too much time in too many communities leaving out the bits that frankly don't make us look all that good. Right.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that. But for you, though, as the writer and also an enrolled member of Cherokee Nation and also someone who is writing about family members who made decisions that you might not have made, where do you think this leaves us?
Yeah. One of the reasons that I wanted to write the book is because I think that the history in the United States of the dispossession of Indigenous people, the ethnic cleansing of Indigenous people, and the genocide of Indigenous people, that history isn't just a problem for Indigenous nations, but it's a problem for our democracy. And what I really wanted to do with the book is tell this specific story and have it be, story first and accessible to people, but that it does have this broad sweep of time where we can sort of step back and think about, well, what does this mean for our country? What does this mean for our government? Because, we talk about, the Trail of Tears pretty extensive. I talk about the Trail of Tears in the book and this chapter of, genocide and violence. And we've never gone back. One, we've never admitted that crime has been committed by our government. And we've never gone back and reformed our laws and reformed our government to make sure that something like that would never happen again. And I think you see these vestiges and this legacy of colonialism in our government still, both with the treatment of Indigenous people, but also with other folks who are at the margins of U.S. empire, whether it's migrants or enemy combatants or the victims of U.S. war. And we have, I think, some really big things to grapple with, that we have inherited as US citizens, that I hope that the book illuminates for readers and is a way for people to start to think about those things.
I think, Rebecca, that is the place to end, because I also don't want to give up any spoilers. And, it's hard to approach a history book as having spoilers, but I think the way you handled this story and all of the disparate parts, there were lots of surprises for me. And as a reader, I think you did some pretty cool stuff. So thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. And By the Fire We Carry is out now.
That was great. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.